The night Elly Warren disappeared did not announce itself as dangerous. It arrived quietly, dressed as routine, carrying the false comfort of familiarity. At exactly 9:42 p.m., a streetlight blinked twice and steadied, casting a pale glow over the pavement as Elly adjusted her jacket and checked the time. She was 20 years old enough to believe she understood the world, young enough to trust it. Cars passed without slowing. Voices drifted from somewhere nearby, laughter dissolving into the air. Nothing about the moment suggested it would become the last ordinary one she would ever have. Yet somewhere in the stillness, something irreversible had already begun. The city was watching, indifferent and vast, absorbing her footsteps without care. Elly moved forward unaware that every step was carrying her deeper into a story that would later be told in fragments. Security footage, witness statements, unanswered messages. This was not a moment of panic. It was calm. And that calm would later feel unbearable to those who tried to understand how everything could end without warning. Elly Warren had always been described as steady, the kind of person who moved through life with quiet confidence rather than noise. She didn't chase attention. She attracted it effortlessly through warmth and ease. Friends said she listened more than she spoke, remembered details others forgot, and had a way of making people feel briefly important. At 20, she stood at a crossroads she didn't yet recognize, balancing responsibility with freedom. She worked part-time, studied when she could, and filled the rest of her life with small ambitions. Travel plans scribbled in notebooks, playlists labeled for moods she hadn't lived yet. The future felt expandable, like something she could stretch and rearrange at will. That belief shaped her decisions, including the one that kept her out later than planned that night. There was no recklessness in her choice, only trust. Trust in the city she knew. Trust in the normalcy of routine. Trust that tomorrow was guaranteed simply because it always had been. Earlier that evening, Elly had hesitated before leaving. The pause lasted no more than a few seconds, barely long enough to register as doubt. She remembered standing in front of the mirror, smoothing her hair, telling herself she'd be quick. There was a message waiting, a conversation unfinished, a promise she intended to keep. She locked the door behind her without a second thought. Down the stairs, onto the sidewalk, into the familiar rhythm of her neighborhood. The route home was one she had taken dozens of times, past shuttered shops, under flickering lights, through streets that felt known enough to ignore. Familiarity breeds comfort, and comfort dulls caution. Elly walked with headphones in, music low, just enough to soften the night. She was present but not alert, relaxed but not careless. The city accepted her presence without acknowledgement. Somewhere beyond her awareness, patterns were aligning. Habits were being confirmed. Predictability was doing what it always does, creating opportunity without intention or malice, simply through repetition. The city itself was neither villain nor protector. It existed as a neutral witness, a complex machine of movement and neglect. That night, it carried on uninterrupted. Buses ran late. Windows glowed with televisions and conversations behind glass. Street corners held stories that would never be told. Elly passed through all of it as just another figure in motion, unremarkable, anonymous. She crossed an intersection as the light changed, her shadow stretching briefly ahead of her before dissolving. A car idled nearby, engine humming, unnoticed. The air felt heavier than usual, though she couldn't have explained why. She slowed for a moment, glancing around, then dismissed the sensation. People learn early not to trust unease unless it comes with proof. Elly continued walking, unaware that this moment, the dismissal of a feeling, would later be isolated, examined, replayed by others searching desperately for meaning. Suspense, in real life, does not announce itself. It hides inside ordinary choices. The first irregularity was sound. Not loud enough to alarm, not sharp enough to identify. Just wrong. A footstep out of rhythm. A pause where they shouldn't have been one. Elly turned slightly, more curious than afraid, her body responding before her mind could label the feeling. She saw nothing unusual. The street looked the same as it always did. That was the danger. Normality is a powerful disguise. She adjusted her bag and kept moving, unaware that the distance between her and safety was shrinking in ways that could not be measured by steps alone. Somewhere behind her, intent existed, quiet, patient, unremarkable in its invisibility. Violence rarely looks like violence until it's too late. It begins as proximity, as presence, as a moment where two paths intersect without permission. The city did not intervene. It never does. It simply provided the setting. What followed unfolded quickly, though time would later distort it into fragments and echoes. There was confusion first, an interruption so abrupt it felt unreal. Elly's thoughts scattered, trying to catch up with events that refused to slow down. Panic arrived late, trailing disbelief. The human mind resists sudden endings. It searches for alternatives, explanations, exits that no longer exist. In those moments, the world narrowed to sensation, pressure, movement, the disorientation of losing control. Then silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the heavy absence that follows disruption. What mattered afterward was not the exact sequence, but the result. Elly was gone from the path she was meant to complete. Her route ended early, without ceremony, without witnesses who understood what they were seeing. The city absorbed the moment and continued breathing. Somewhere, a phone buzzed unanswered. Somewhere, a door remained locked from the inside. Somewhere, a future collapsed quietly, without spectacle. The first person to notice was waiting. Waiting turned into confusion, confusion into worry. Messages went unread. Calls rang out into nothing. There is a particular kind of fear that grows in the gap between expectation and silence. It starts as rational reassurance and hardens slowly into dread. Friends retraced conversations, scanning for missed signals, convincing themselves there must be a simple explanation. Elly was reliable. She wouldn't vanish without reason. That belief sustained them for hours longer than it should have. Hope is stubborn when it's built on familiarity. By the time concern reached urgency, the night had already erased crucial details. Footprints blended into others. Sounds dissolved into memory. The city offered no answers, only distance. When morning came, it brought clarity without comfort. Elly's absence became undeniable. The story shifted from waiting to searching, from optimism to procedure. And in that shift, everything became heavier. Authorities moved with trained efficiency, though efficiency offered no reassurance. Timelines were constructed, then revised. Witnesses were questioned, then re-questioned. Each answer produced more uncertainty. Elly's last known movements were mapped with precision she had never needed while alive. Cameras revealed partial truths, blurred images, incomplete angles, moments that raised more questions than they resolved. Every frame was scrutinized, every second slowed, as if time itself might confess if pressured enough. Friends and family watched the process unfold with growing helplessness. The language of investigation felt cold, mechanical, unsuited to the emotional weight it carried. Elly became a subject, a case, a name on documents. Yet to those who loved her, she remained vividly present, her voice in memory, her habits painfully intact. The disconnect between procedure and grief widened with each passing hour. Suspense no longer lived in the moment of disappearance. It lived in waiting rooms, in phone calls that began with hope and ended with apology. As days passed, public attention arrived unevenly. Some listened. Others speculated. The story spread, simplified and reshaped by distance. Elly's life was reduced to timelines and theories, her complexity flattened into narrative convenience. Online discussions grew louder than evidence. Certainty formed where facts were absent. This noise complicated everything, obscuring rather than clarifying. Investigators urged patience. Families pleaded for focus. Meanwhile, time continued its quiet work of erasure. Memories softened. Witness confidence faded. Small details once thought insignificant began to feel crucial. Suspense stretched thin, no longer sharp but constant. It settled into daily life like a low ache. Those closest to Elly learned to exist inside uncertainty, functioning outwardly while remaining suspended inwardly. The world expected adjustment. Grief resisted it. Each unanswered question reinforced the same truth. Some stories do not move toward resolution. They linger, demanding attention without offering closure. Elly's room remained unchanged for weeks. Clothes folded. Notes left where she last touched them. The space argued against finality, whispering that she would return to claim her life. Family members avoided certain corners, not out of superstition, but because presence still felt possible there. Accepting absence required a decision no one was ready to make. Outside, the city continued uninterrupted, indifferent to personal catastrophe. People walked the same streets Elly had walked, unaware they were moving through a space now marked by loss. The contrast was jarring. How easily the world accommodates tragedy without acknowledgement. Friends gathered, sharing stories, repeating familiar phrases in an attempt to stabilize reality. Elly lived on in those moments, briefly restored through memory. But memory could not answer questions. It could not undo what had happened. It could only remind everyone of what had been taken. The investigation reached plateaus where progress slowed and hope faltered. Leads narrowed. Possibilities widened. Someone, somewhere, knew more than they were saying. That belief hovered constantly, both motivating and exhausting. Each new tip sparked anticipation, followed by disappointment. Time transformed urgency into endurance. The case no longer dominated headlines, but it never disappeared from those directly affected. Elly's name carried weight wherever it was spoken, heavy with implication. Suspense shifted from what happened to whether the truth would ever surface. This uncertainty reshaped grief into something harder to carry. Without answers, mourning had no direction. It circled endlessly, searching for an endpoint that refused to appear. The absence of resolution became its own form of trauma, one that persisted quietly long after public attention moved elsewhere. As months passed, Elly's story began to symbolize something larger. Conversations expanded beyond her life to include questions of safety, routine, and assumption. How many moments go unquestioned because they resemble yesterday? How often does familiarity replace awareness? These questions circulated, uncomfortable but necessary. Elly's absence forced reflection not through spectacle, but through relatability. She was not reckless. She was not extraordinary. She was ordinary in the most dangerous way, because ordinary stories are the ones people see themselves in. That recognition unsettled many who followed her case. Suspense, once external, turned inward. People replayed their own routines, noticing patterns they had never questioned. In that sense, Elly's story continued to move, influencing lives even as her own had ended. Memorials appeared quietly. Candles on sidewalks. Notes taped to lampposts. Flowers that wilted and were replaced. These gestures did not explain anything, but they insisted on remembrance. They transformed anonymous space into meaningful ground. The city responded subtly, lighting adjusted, patrols shifted, awareness campaigns introduced. Small changes, insufficient but symbolic. They acknowledged that something had gone wrong. For those who knew Elly, these gestures offered limited comfort. Recognition did not restore what was lost, but it prevented erasure. It confirmed that her life had registered, that her absence had been noticed. In a world that moves quickly past tragedy, that acknowledgement mattered. It allowed grief to exist publicly rather than in isolation. Time continued its uneven progression. Some days passed unnoticed, others reopened wounds without warning. Anniversaries arrived carrying expectations no one wanted to meet. Elly would never age beyond 20 in memory. That permanence felt cruel. Friends changed. Families adjusted. Life moved forward unevenly, dragging grief along with it. The story remained unresolved, suspended between past and present. Suspense no longer demanded answers, it simply endured. People learned to live with the unanswered, not because it made sense, but because it was unavoidable. Elly's story became less about the moment she disappeared and more about the space she left behind. That space reshaped relationships, priorities, and perceptions. It became part of the lives it touched, a quiet constant beneath everyday routines. Years later, the details remained fragmented. Some questions softened with time. Others sharpened. The absence of resolution never fully receded, but it changed form. It became quieter, less urgent, but no less present. Elly existed now as memory and meaning rather than narrative conclusion. Her story resisted closure, refusing to be simplified into lesson or warning alone. It remained human, messy, incomplete, unresolved. And perhaps that was its final truth. Not every story ends with answers. Some end with responsibility, with awareness, with the insistence that a 20-year-old life mattered enough to be remembered, even when certainty remains out of reach. In the years that followed, the question people asked most often was not what happened, but how it could have happened so quietly. Elly's disappearance had no dramatic warning signs, no obvious mistakes, no single reckless decision that could be isolated and blamed. That absence of clarity made the story harder to contain. It suggested that danger did not require chaos to exist. It could live comfortably inside routine. Investigators continued their work in cycles, renewed attention followed by inevitable slowdowns. Each review of the case reopened wounds while offering little relief. For Elly's family, hope became conditional. They learned to manage expectations, to brace themselves against disappointment even when new information surfaced. Suspense, once sharp and immediate, had transformed into something long-term and exhausting. It lingered in unanswered emails, in phone calls that never came, in every unfamiliar name that appeared in the news. The story no longer belonged to a single night. It belonged to time itself, stretching endlessly forward. Friends noticed how memory began to change. At first, Elly felt close, vivid, present in everyday moments. Over time, her image softened, not because love faded, but because life continued demanding attention. This created a quiet guilt. Moving forward felt like leaving her behind. People measured milestones against her absence, calculating how old she would be now, what she might be doing. These imagined futures became a parallel story, one that existed only in thought. Suspense lived there too, in the imagined versions of Elly who kept growing while the real one remained frozen at 20. The contrast was painful but unavoidable. It reinforced the sense that something unfinished was always hovering nearby. Even joy felt complicated, arriving with an echo of loss. Elly's story had woven itself into the fabric of those who loved her, altering how they experienced time, expectation, and possibility. Public interest returned in waves, often triggered by unrelated events that echoed elements of Elly's case. Each resurgence brought renewed scrutiny and, with it, renewed frustration. Old theories resurfaced, sometimes treated as breakthroughs despite having been examined before. This repetition underscored how little progress had been made. For the family, media attention was a double-edged presence, necessary to keep the case alive, painful in its reminders. They learned to speak carefully, to balance hope with realism, to protect their private grief from public consumption. Suspense, in this phase, became performative. It existed not just in uncertainty, but in the act of waiting visibly, under observation. The story was no longer private tragedy alone. It had become a shared narrative, shaped by audiences who wanted answers but did not have to live with the consequences of not receiving them. As time passed, investigators focused increasingly on patterns rather than moments. They examined routines, environments, assumptions, the invisible structures that shape behavior. Elly's life, once lived instinctively, was now analyzed methodically. This shift reframed the story. It suggested that her disappearance was not only about an individual act, but about conditions that allowed such acts to occur unnoticed. Lighting, visibility, predictability, response time, details that rarely draw attention until they fail. These discussions moved the story beyond Elly herself, placing it within a broader context. That expansion offered some meaning, but it also emphasized the scale of the problem. Elly's case was not isolated. It was part of a pattern that extended far beyond her. Suspense deepened here, no longer tied solely to her fate, but to the question of how many similar stories existed without recognition. For Elly's family, daily life settled into a new rhythm shaped by absence. Ordinary tasks carried reminders, a favorite song on the radio, a passing remark, a familiar scent. Grief became less explosive but more persistent, like a low-frequency sound that never fully faded. They learned to answer questions they had asked themselves countless times, to explain their story to newcomers who did not understand its weight. Hope, once urgent, had become quieter, more cautious. It no longer promised resolution. It simply refused complete surrender. Suspense, for them, was no longer about discovery. It was about endurance, about waking each day without answers and continuing anyway. Elly's presence lingered not as image, but as influence, shaping decisions, priorities, and perceptions long after her physical absence had become undeniable. The city where Elly disappeared continued to change, as cities always do. New buildings rose. Old landmarks vanished. Streets were repaved, intersections redesigned. Yet beneath these changes, the memory remained embedded. Certain places carried an invisible weight, known only to those who understood. For them, geography had meaning beyond maps. Walking those streets felt different, charged with memory and unresolved tension. Suspense lived in these spaces, activated by proximity rather than narrative. It was not about what might happen next, but about what had already happened and could not be undone. Elly's story had altered the emotional landscape, turning ordinary locations into quiet memorials. This transformation was subtle and personal, unnoticed by most, but profound for those who carried it. As years accumulated, questions about closure surfaced repeatedly. What does it mean to move on without answers? Is acceptance possible without understanding? These questions had no consensus, only individual interpretations. Some sought meaning through advocacy, channeling grief into action. Others withdrew, choosing privacy over exposure. Both paths were valid, shaped by different needs. Elly's story resisted resolution, but it continued to provoke reflection. It forced people to confront discomfort, the reality that not every narrative resolves neatly, that justice is not guaranteed, that life can fracture without explanation. Suspense, in this sense, became philosophical. It challenged assumptions about fairness and predictability. Elly's absence asked questions the world was not equipped to answer fully. The imagined future versions of Elly began to feel more distant with time, yet they never disappeared entirely. Instead, they evolved into symbols of possibility lost. Graduations uncelebrated, careers unexplored, relationships unlived. These imagined milestones served as quiet reminders of scale, the magnitude of what 20 years represents. Elly's age became a fixed point, a reference against which time was measured. Each passing year widened the gap between who she was and who she might have been. Suspense lingered in that gap, not as tension, but as ache. It was the space where imagination filled in for reality, creating a parallel narrative that existed only in memory and speculation. Occasionally, new information surfaced, small, ambiguous, rarely conclusive. Each instance reignited attention and hope, followed by familiar disappointment. This cycle reinforced a difficult truth. Suspense does not always build toward climax. Sometimes it stretches indefinitely, testing endurance rather than curiosity. For those invested in Elly's story, learning to manage this cycle became essential. They tempered reactions, guarded emotions, prepared for outcomes that might never arrive. The absence of resolution became normalized, though never accepted. Elly's story existed in a state of permanent anticipation, suspended between past and possibility. That suspension reshaped how people understood time itself, not as a straight line toward answers, but as a looping path that revisited the same questions again and again. Memory played a complicated role. It preserved Elly while also altering her. Stories repeated often gained polish, smoothing imperfections, emphasizing warmth. This was not dishonesty, but preservation. People remembered what they needed to remember in order to survive the loss. Elly became, in some ways, more than she had been in life, not because reality was insufficient, but because meaning demanded reinforcement. Suspense faded from the specifics of her disappearance and relocated into interpretation. Who was Elly, truly? What did her life represent? These questions replaced procedural ones, shifting focus from outcome to significance. Her story became less about solving a mystery and more about honoring a presence that could no longer speak for itself. Younger people who learned about Elly's story encountered it differently. Without personal memory, they approached it as caution, as example, as narrative. This generational shift altered the story's function. It became educational, reflective, preventative. Elly's name carried lessons rather than familiarity. While this transition felt necessary, it also underscored time's passage. The people who had known her best now carried responsibility for accuracy, resisting simplification while acknowledging inevitability. Suspense, for newer audiences, existed primarily in imagination. For those who lived it, suspense had already become lived experience, etched into years rather than moments. Despite everything, Elly's story never fully concluded. It settled into a form of quiet persistence. It surfaced in conversations, in policy discussions, in personal reflections. It reminded people that safety is often assumed rather than guaranteed, that normalcy can be misleading. These realizations did not arrive with fear, but with attentiveness. Elly's absence encouraged observation, of surroundings, of routines, of moments usually ignored. In this way, her story continued to move, influencing behavior long after events had ended. Suspense transformed into awareness, a lasting tension between comfort and caution. There were moments of peace too, unexpected and fleeting. Times when remembering Elly brought warmth rather than pain. Laughter shared over old stories. Gratitude for having known her at all. These moments did not negate loss, but they softened its edges. They suggested that meaning could coexist with sorrow. Elly's story, though unresolved, had not been erased by time. It had been integrated. Suspense no longer demanded answers in those moments. It rested, allowing space for remembrance without urgency. In the broader sense, Elly's story challenged the idea that every narrative must resolve to matter. It demonstrated that impact does not depend on conclusion. A life can influence without explanation, shape without closure. Elly's 20 years carried weight beyond their length, not because of how they ended, but because of how they were lived and remembered. Suspense remained, but it was no longer dominant. It existed alongside responsibility, the responsibility to notice, to care, to remember. That responsibility outlasted investigation timelines and public attention. It endured quietly, carried forward by those who refused to forget. In the end, Elly Warren remains 20 years old in memory, suspended in time yet moving through lives in subtle ways. Her story does not close with certainty or justice neatly defined. It closes with awareness, with the understanding that ordinary moments deserve attention, that assumptions can be dangerous, and that absence leaves lasting marks. This documentary does not offer answers because none are complete. Instead, it offers remembrance. Elly's life mattered. Her story matters. And in the unresolved space it leaves behind, it asks one final thing, not for fear, but for care.